The water was a brown, roaring beast, a liquid avalanche that had consumed the valley. From the safety of Miller's Hill, the surviving townsfolk of Blackwood Creek watched the apocalypse unfold below. The river, normally a lazy green serpent in summer, had swollen into a mythological monster, its back 10 feet higher than anyone had ever seen. It was tearing the town apart, one board at a time. Gable's Mercantile, the pride of the main street, had its front windows burst, and a torrent of brown water was now vomiting out barrels and bolts of cloth. The stables were gone, the livery was gone, and the church steeple, a landmark for 50 years, had surrendered with a groan and vanished into the churn. Only one structure remained defiant in the river's direct path, the old stone bridge. It was the town's anchor, its connection to the world, and it was taking the full, thunderous force of the flood. Debris, entire trees, the wreckage of barns, the bloated carcasses of livestock, crashed against its stone piers with concussive booms that echoed up the hill. And somewhere beneath that tormented bridge, in a burrow dug into the riverbank, was the boy. The fool boy. Finn. They all remembered him, the quiet, grim-faced 18-year-old who had spent the last 6 months digging in the dirt like a mole. Sheriff Miller shook his head, the rain plastering his grey hair to his scalp. God have mercy on his soul. Poor kid never stood a chance. Anna Gable stood beside her father, her knuckles white as she gripped a wet wool blanket. She didn't say anything. She just stared at the bridge, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She had been the only one who didn't call him a fool, at least not to his face. She'd seen the geometry in his work, the strange, quiet confidence in his eyes. But this? This was not a storm. This was a judgment, and not even Finn's careful hands could build a fortress against God himself. The roar intensified, and a section of the riverbank downstream carved off, dissolving into the current. It's a 100-year flood, someone whispered in awe and terror. Maybe more. As the hours passed and the grey light of morning finally broke through the bruised clouds, the rain lessened to a drizzle. The river's crest had passed. It was still a terrifying torrent, but its ravenous anger had subsided into a deep, guttural growl. The town was gone. A landscape of mud and ruin was all that remained. But the bridge, scarred and battered, still stood. And as the people stared, a collective gasp went through the small crowd. There, nestled into the massive stone abutment on the far side, protected by the colossal pier that had split the current like the prow of a great ship, was a small, dark square of timber. A door. Impossibly, it was still there. As they watched, the door creaked open. A figure emerged, blinking in the weak light, a silhouette against the impossible survival of his home. It was Finn. He was alive. And in that moment, the story of the fool boy ended, and the legend of the bridge builder began. 6 months earlier, the only roaring sound was the one in Finn's ears, the echo of a slammed door and his father's slurred, final pronouncement. If you think book learning and your granddad's ghost stories are gonna put food on this table, you're a bigger fool than he was. Get out. Don't come back till you're a man who can earn his keep. The cold of the autumn night was a physical slap, so bring him faster than the shock. He had nothing but the clothes on his back, a small canvas sack with a worn book of his grandfather's diagrams, a whetstone, and a clasp knife. The shack he had called home was a dark shape behind him, a place that had held no warmth since his mother had passed, and even less since the whiskey had taken over what was left of his father. He walked the 3 miles to town not with a destination in mind, but simply to put distance between himself and that slammed door. The shame was a hot coal in his gut. Every window in Blackwood Creek seemed like a judging eye. He was an outcast now, a stray. His grandfather's words, a low and steady murmur that had been his only real guidance for years, came to him then. The world will always try to knock you down, son. It's not about staying on your feet. It's about where you choose to land, and how you build up from there. He found himself by the river, the Blackwood, its gentle current whispering under the massive stone arches of the bridge. The bridge had been his grandfather's masterpiece. He'd been the lead mason, a man who understood stone and water as if they spoke a language he'd been born knowing. Finn looked at the colossal abutments, the foundations that his grandfather had sunk 30 feet down to solid bedrock. He saw not just a bridge, but a promise. a testament to permanence in a world that felt terrifyingly temporary. He crept down the embankment, out of the wind, and laid a hand on the cold, damp stone of the largest pier. It was immense, a man-made cliff designed to shear the force of ice and floodwater. And right behind it, tucked into the curve where the pier met the earthen bank, was a small, protected space, a pocket of calm in the river's path. The ground here was high, composed of dense, compacted clay and rock, almost 10 feet above the normal water line. It was a hydraulic shadow, a term his grandfather had used. A place the river's full force would flow around, not over. An idea, cold and desperate but fiercely logical, began to form. He wasn't just looking at a place to sleep for the night. He was looking at a place to land. He could build here. He could dig into the bank itself, using the bridge's own unshakable foundation as his shield. It would be secret, it would be difficult, and it would be his. He spent the night huddled in that space, the stone at his back feeling less like cold rock and more like the spine of his ancestor. The next morning, he didn't go looking for charity. He went to the old collapsed barn on the Weatherby property, a place everyone had picked clean of good timber years ago. But Finn wasn't looking for good timber. He was looking for forgotten strength. He started with a broken shovel he'd found by the railroad tracks, its handle splintered. He spent the first 2 days just sharpening the shovel's rusted blade on his whetstone and fashioning a new handle from a sturdy piece of hickory he cut with his knife. The work was slow, but it was his work. Then came the digging. The ground beneath the bridge was not soft soil. It was a geological layer cake of hard-packed clay, gravel, and stone that had been compressed for a century. Each shovelful was a battle. His hands, soft from a youth spent more with books than with tools, were raw and bleeding by the end of the first day. He ignored the pain, focusing on his grandfather's voice in his head. Measure twice. Cut once. But before all that, you watch. Watch the water, watch the sun, watch the wind. Nature tells you everything you need to know about where to build, so he watched. He noted how the sun never touched this particular spot, keeping it cool. He saw how the wind whipped over the top of the bridge, leaving the space below relatively calm. He spent an entire day just observing the river's current, tossing sticks into the water to map the flow around the stone pier. He was designing not just a shelter, but a system, a structure in harmony with the forces that would one day try to destroy it. His presence did not go unnoticed. Sheriff Miller was the first to approach, a tall man whose posture radiated a weary authority. "Son, what do you think you're doing down here?" Finn paused, leaning on his shovel, his face smeared with dirt. "Building a place to stay," sir, the sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is town property. You can't just dig a hole and live in it. It ain't safe. A good rain comes, and you'll be washed out." "It won't wash out," Finn said, his voice quiet but firm. "The foundation of this pier goes to bedrock. And the bank here is the highest point. The water will go around." Sheriff Miller looked at the boy's ragged clothes and determined face, seeing not a vagrant but a stubbornness he didn't have the heart to crush just yet. "I'll give you a week. Then you need to find proper lodgings." The week passed, and Finn's hole had become a small, neat cavern. The sheriff returned, saw the meticulous pile of excavated earth being used to create a gentle, erosion-resistant slope away from the entrance, and just shook his head, walking away without a word. The town's other leading citizen, Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, was less forgiving. Finn went to him, his hands clutching the few coins he'd earned doing odd jobs, hoping for credit for a box of nails and a small handsaw. Gable looked at him over his spectacles, his expression a mixture of pity and disdain. "I heard you were digging a grave for yourself under the bridge. I'm not financing that kind of foolishness. Cash only, boy." The word spread. He became a local curiosity, that bridge troll. Other young men would sometimes wander down to mock him, to throw rocks into the river near his excavation. "Building a den, Finn? Winter's coming, better gather your nuts." He never responded. He just kept digging, his movements economical and precise, his focus absolute. Each taunt was another stone he used to build the wall of his resolve. The foundation was everything. His grandfather had drilled that into him until it was as much a part of him as his own bones. "A house is just a roof and walls," he used to say, his voice thick with the dust of the quarry. "But a home is a foundation. You get that wrong, and you're just building a fancy coffin." Finn wasn't building with new materials. He couldn't afford them. His currency was effort and ingenuity. He spent weeks hauling old, discarded railroad ties from the abandoned spur line 2 miles upriver. They were heavy, creosote-soaked monsters, and moving each one was a day-long ordeal of leverage, sweat, and sheer willpower. Other scavengers had left them, deeming them too rotten or too heavy to be of use. But Finn saw their inner strength. He used his handsaw to cut away the rotted outer layers, revealing the dense, oil-blackened heartwood within. For the posts that would frame his shelter, he went back to the collapsed Weatherby barn. He dug in the mud and debris where others had only surface-picked, and he found them, sections of oak beams, half-buried and forgotten. They were waterlogged and heavy, but the core of the wood was sound. He spent a week dragging them back to his site. Then came the most important part of the preparation, a lesson straight from the old world. He built a small, controlled fire and began charring the ends of every post and beam that would have contact with the earth. The process was slow and smoky, drawing curious glances from the bridge above, but Finn worked with the patience of a craftsman. The layer of carbon he was creating would be a natural barrier against moisture and insects, a technique that would make the wood last for decades. The earth is hungry, his grandfather had taught him. It wants to reclaim everything. You have to give it a meal it can't digest. He laid a bed of gravel, which he'd hauled bucket by bucket from a sandbar downstream, to create a French drain system that would channel any ground moisture away from his floor. On top of this, he placed flat stones he'd levered out of the riverbank, creating a solid, dry base. Only then did he begin to erect the frame. He worked with a simple rope pulley and the timeless principles of leverage. He notched the beams with his knife and saw, fitting them together with a precision that belied his crude tools. He used the nails he had finally been able to purchase, all $17.04 of his savings, sparingly. He counted each one. Each hammer blow was a declaration of his intent to stay. The cost was a mantra in his head. $17.04. It was the price of his independence, the total sum of his worldly assets invested into this hole in the ground. He wasn't just building a shelter, he was building a new life from the wreckage of his old one, and the cost was everything he had. The frame was low and stout, anchored directly to the stone of the bridge abutment on one side, making the ancient masonry one of his walls. He was borrowing its strength, making his small home an extension of the most solid structure in the entire county. Her name was Anna Gable, and she was not like the others. She didn't mock him. She watched him. She'd see him from the window of her father's store, a small, solitary figure moving with a purpose that seemed alien to the aimless loitering of the other young men in town. Her father's dismissive comments about the bridge troll only fueled her curiosity. One afternoon, she packed a small parcel of leftover bread and salted pork and walked down to the river. Finn didn't hear her approach over the rhythmic scrape of his shovel. He looked up, startled, as her shadow fell over him. He was thinner than she'd realized, his face all sharp angles and smudged with dirt, but his eyes were clear and intense. "Brought you something," she said, holding out the parcel. He wiped his hands on his trousers before taking it, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "Thank you." He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw softened for a moment. He sat on a rock and ate with a slow, deliberate hunger that made her feel ashamed of her own full stomach. "My father says you're trying to drown yourself before the river does it for you," she said, breaking the silence. Finn finished a piece of bread before answering. "Your father sees a hole in the ground. He doesn't see the bedrock under it." He stood up and gestured toward the massive stone pier. "See how the water flows? Even when it's high, the main force is deflected by that pier. It creates a pocket of slack water right here. My grandfather called it a hydraulic shadow. This spot," he stamped his foot on the ground, "is the safest place on the entire riverbank." He spoke with a certainty that was compelling. He explained the charring of the wood, the gravel foundation for drainage, the way he planned to anchor the roof structure directly into the mortar of the bridge itself. He wasn't a madman digging a hole, he was an engineer working with what he had. Anna found herself listening, truly listening. She saw the logic, the inherited wisdom that was as solid as the stones he was building on. From that day on, her visits became more frequent. She started bringing him things he needed more than food: a half-used ball of twine, a cracked lantern with a bit of oil still in it, a handful of bent nails she'd straightened herself. One day, she arrived with a heavy roll of tar paper. "It was in the back of the store," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Damaged." Father was going to throw it out. Finn looked at the roll, then at her. He knew what it was worth. He knew it wasn't just damaged goods. It was the single most important element he was missing, the one thing that would make his roof truly waterproof. It was a gift of trust. "I can't pay you for this," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "I know," she replied. Her belief was a small but steady flame. When the first autumn storm blew through, a squall that sent people scurrying indoors, Anna worried. The river rose a foot, and the wind howled. The next day, she went down to the bridge, expecting to find his work washed away. Instead, she found him calmly reinforcing a section of the wall where the wind had driven the rain in. The test had revealed a flaw, and he was already fixing it. He was learning, adapting. He was going to make it. The shelter grew from a skeleton of beams into a solid, living space. The walls were a testament to Finn's resourcefulness. He built a double wall, a technique his grandfather had used for cold-weather cabins. The outer layer was made of thick, salvaged planks, carefully overlapped to shed water. The inner wall was fashioned from smoother, thinner boards he'd planed by hand with a piece of sharpened steel. The 4-inch gap between the walls, he meticulously packed with a mixture of dried moss, cattail fluff, and straw he'd gathered from the fields after the harvest. It was insulation, a barrier against the bitter cold he knew was coming. He used Anna's tar paper on the roof, laying it over the planking before adding a final layer of packed earth and sod. The roof was angled slightly, not to shed water toward the river, but to drain it back, deep into the riverbank, using the earth itself as a sponge. His grandfather's book of diagrams was his Bible. It was filled with hand-drawn sketches of truss designs, mortise, and tenon joints, and notes on the physics of load-bearing structures. Finn would study it by the light of the smoky lantern Anna had given him, his finger tracing the lines, the old Inca connection to the man who had taught him how to see the world not as it was, but as it could be built. He constructed a small stove from an old oil drum he'd pulled from the river and encased it in flat river stones mortared together with clay. A narrow pipe snaked up and out through a carefully sealed hole in the wall, the design ensuring that the smoke would be carried away by the prevailing winds. The first time he lit a fire, the small, 10 by 12-foot space filled with a dry, radiant heat. It was the first true warmth he had felt in months. It felt like a home. He built a simple bunk into the wall, a small table, and a shelf for his few possessions, the book, the whetstone, and a small, smooth stone his mother had once given him. He felt a burgeoning pride, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful. He had built this. With his own hands, against the scorn of an entire town, he had carved out a space for himself in the world. But the pride was shadowed by a profound loneliness. The rhythmic work kept his hands busy, but his mind was often adrift. In the quiet evenings, with the river whispering outside, the weight of his isolation would settle on him. It was in these moments he would repeat the old motto, his grandfather's words a charm against despair. The river gives, and the river takes, but it always respects what's built right. He was building it right. He had to believe that. The smaller squalls and early winter freezes were his trials. He learned how the frost heaved the ground, and added deeper anchors to his main posts. He discovered a draft coming from a poorly sealed window frame, a small pane of glass he'd found and carefully set into the wall, and spent a day resealing it with pitch pine sap. Each problem solved made the shelter stronger, and him more confident. He was no longer just surviving, he was adapting, hardening, becoming as resilient as the structure he inhabited. The change began subtly. A shift in the color of the sky, a strange stillness in the air that felt heavier than it should. The squirrels, usually a chattering nuisance, vanished. The birds that nested under the eaves of the bridge took flight in a great, silent flock and headed inland. Finn felt it in his bones, a deep, primal unease he'd learned to trust. His grandfather had called it weather sense, the ability to read the land's silent warnings. The old-timers in Gables Mercantile talked about the coming rain, but their words were casual, dismissive. Just another spring shower, one said. Good for the crops, but Finn saw the signs they missed. The river's surface had a glassy, expectant sheen. The air smelled not of rain, but of the deep, wet earth, as if the ground itself was saturated and could hold no more. The rain began on a Tuesday, a soft, persistent drizzle that felt more like a mist. By Wednesday, it was a steady drumming on his sod roof. By Thursday, it was a roar. The river began to change. Its placid green color mudded to a sullen brown. It grew restless, its currents quickening, eddies swirling where none had been before. It was rising, not by inches, but by feet. Finn worked with a quiet, focused urgency. He hauled his store of firewood inside, stacking it high against the back wall. He checked the seals on his door and his small window one last time, forcing a mixture of tallow and ash into any crevice he could find. He secured a heavy rope to one of the main roof beams, letting the other end lie coiled on the floor. A lifeline, just in case. He made the climb up the riverbank and went to town, his oilskin coat shedding water. He found Anna stacking sandbags in front of her father's store, a futile gesture against the water already pooling in the street. "It's coming," he said, his voice low and urgent, barely audible over the storm. "This isn't a normal flood. The ground is already full. It's all going to run straight into the river." "Father won't listen," she said, her face pale with worry. "He says we've seen high water before." "Not like this," Finn insisted. "Tell him to move the goods from his cellar. Tell him to move them to the second floor." Now Mr. Gable emerged from the store, his face a mask of stubborn pride. "I've run this store for 30 years, boy. I know how to handle a spring flood. I'll trust my own eyes over the bridge troll's fantasies. Now get off my property before you track mud everywhere." Finn looked from the man's angry face to Anna's pleading one. He had given the warning. He could do no more. He turned and walked back toward the river, toward the only place he knew was built to withstand what was coming. The water was already licking at the base of his door, a hungry, probing tongue. He slipped inside, barred the heavy timber door, and settled in to wait. The world outside dissolved into a symphony of destruction. The sound was the first thing to become unbearable. It was not just the roar of the water, a constant, deafening thunder that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. It was the wrenching, screaming sound of the town dying. He heard the sharp crack of ancient trees snapping, the low groaning of buildings surrendering their foundations. And then there were the impacts. Every few minutes, a cataclysmic boom would shudder through the entire bridge structure, transmitted down the stone pier and through the packed earth into his shelter. It felt like being inside a drum being beaten by a giant. A log, a section of a roof, a dead cow, he could only imagine what debris the river was hurling at his shield. The darkness inside was absolute, broken only by the faint, sputtering light of his lantern. Water began to force its way in, not in a flood, but in 100 tiny, insidious streams. It seeped through the floorboards, bubbled up where the walls met the stone. The French drain he had built was overwhelmed. The floor was soon covered in 1 inch, then 2 inches of frigid water. He didn't panic. His grandfather had told him stories of working in caissoons deep below the river, of the constant fight against water. He began to bail, using a wooden bucket to scoop the water and throw it into a small sump he had dug in the corner, which at least localized the worst of the inflow. He worked mechanically, his mind focused on the rhythm: scoop, lift, pour. It was a race he was losing, but the work kept the terror at bay. The air grew thick and cold, his breath pluming in the lantern light. The pressure in the small space was immense, a physical weight on his chest. Sometime in the deepest part of the night came the worst impact of all. A noise like a cannonball strike, followed by a grinding, screeching tremor that felt like the end of the world. The bridge itself seemed to scream. A shower of dust and mortar rained down from the ceiling where his shelter met the stone pier. The lantern flickered and died, plunging him into a terrifying, roaring blackness. He was sure this was it. The pier had failed. The bridge was coming down. He braced himself for the crushing weight of 1,000 tons of stone. But it didn't come. The shaking subsided, replaced by the familiar, steady roar. He fumbled in the dark, his hand shaking, and managed to relight the lantern. A new crack had appeared in the stone wall, a jagged black line running from floor to ceiling. But it was holding. The bridge, and his home, were holding. He sat in the cold water, his back against the wall, and felt a strange calm settle over him. He had done all he could. He had built it right. The rest was up to the river. He thought of Anna, of her father's foolish pride. He prayed they had made it to high ground. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm, no longer as an enemy, but as a force of nature he had chosen to face on his own terms. He had built his foundation on the bedrock, and now he would see if it was enough. As the first hint of grey dawn filtered through the tiny, grimy window, the sound began to change. The violent, percussive fury of the flood lessened, the deep roar subsiding into a steady, powerful hum. The water level inside the shelter had risen to his shins, but it had stopped rising. The crest had passed. Exhaustion, cold, and relief washed over Finn in a wave that left him dizzy. He waited another hour, listening as the world outside grew quieter, until the only sound was the gurgle of the receding water. He unbarred the door. It took all his strength to shove it open against the pressure of the mud and debris that had piled up against it. He stepped out into a world remade. The sky was a clean, washed grey. The air smelled of mud and wet, splintered wood. Before him lay a scene of utter devastation. The river was still a wide, brown expanse, but it had retreated from the town, leaving behind a thick blanket of silt that covered everything. Buildings were smashed into kindling or simply gone. The main street was an impassable swamp of wreckage. He stood there, a solitary figure in a ruined landscape, his small, sturdy shelter a defiant anomaly. Then he looked up toward Miller's Hill. He could see them, a small cluster of people, dark shapes against the pale sky. They were staring down at the valley, at the ruins of their lives. And they were staring at him. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if they were looking at a ghost. Then, a figure broke from the group, scrambling down the slick, muddy hillside. It was Anna. She half ran, half slid down the treacherous slope, not stopping until she reached him, her boots sinking into the mud. She threw her arms around him, her face buried in his wet, grimy coat. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed, her voice muffled. "I thought it took you." Finn held her, his own exhaustion making him unsteady. "It's all right," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm all right." Others began to follow her down, their movement slow, their faces etched with shock. Sheriff Miller was among them, his uniform caked in mud. He stopped a few feet from the shelter, his eyes taking in the solid construction, the way the water had flowed perfectly around it, leaving it almost untouched. He looked at Finn, and the weary authority in his eyes was replaced by something else, a deep, profound respect. Then came Mr. Gable. His store was a hollowed-out shell, its contents strewn for half a mile downstream. His pride had been washed away with his inventory. He walked up to Finn, his shoulders slumped. He looked at the shelter, then at the boy he had called a fool, a troll, a fantasist. "You tried to warn me," Gable said, his voice cracking. "You tried to tell me." Finn simply nodded. There was no triumph in his gaze, only a shared, weary sorrow for what had been lost. He had been proven right, but there was no joy in it. The river had respected what was built right, but it had taken everything else. In the days and weeks that followed, the town of Blackwood Creek began the slow, arduous task of digging itself out. The scale of the loss was staggering. But amidst the grief and the ruin, a new kind of currency emerged. It wasn't money or property, it was knowledge. And Finn, the outcast, was suddenly the richest man in town. He didn't gloat or say, "I told you so." He simply worked. He helped them salvage timber, showing them how to spot the sound wood from the rotten. He explained the principles of drainage, of why certain foundations had failed while others, by sheer luck, had held. He showed them how to read the land, how to see the invisible paths the water would always take. He was no longer the bridge troll, he was Finn the Builder. People who had once mocked him now sought his counsel. Sheriff Miller tasked him with helping to plan the layout of the new town, which would be rebuilt on higher ground. "We're not making the same mistakes twice," the sheriff said, clapping a hand on Finn's shoulder. "We're going to build it right this time." Mr. Gable, a broken but humbled man, offered Finn a partnership. "I have the capital, or what's left of it. You have the sense. Together, we could rebuild the mercantile. Build it stronger than before." Finn accepted. His relationship with Anna deepened, their bond forged not in whispered sweet nothings, but in the shared trauma of the flood and the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. They were a natural team. He designed, she managed. He saw the structure, she saw the community it would serve. His shelter under the bridge became a local legend. A few of the town's children, emboldened by his new status, would creep down to peer at it, whispering stories of the boy who had lived through the Great Flood. Finn kept it just as it was, a monument to his survival and a reminder of his beginnings. It was his anchor, the place he had landed when the world had knocked him down. One evening, months later, as he and Anna stood on the hill overlooking the skeleton of the new town rising from the mud, she took his hand. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, nodding toward the bridge. "Being down there, all alone." Finn looked at the dark shadow under the stone arches, the place that had been his entire world. "I don't miss being alone," he said. "But I'm grateful for what it taught me." He had gone under the bridge to hide from the world, a boy cast out. He had emerged a man who would help rebuild it. His grandfather's legacy was not just in the old stone bridge that had weathered the storm, but in the grandson who had learned its lessons. The river had given him a home, and it had taken the town's ignorance. And in its wake, it had left a foundation, not of stone or wood, but of respect, upon which a whole new future could be built. The cost was no longer $17.04. The value was immeasurable.